we welcome in Bryan Munson of Husker Online. Bryan, it's been a couple weeks away from home for the Huskers. They come back with a 1-1 record since they were last at home on a Saturday against Northern Iowa. Let's start with just Illinois and Purdue. What have you liked out of the Huskers these last couple weeks, and what maybe has you worried with 7 games to go on the schedule?
Oh, hey, guys. Well, what's to be worried about? Well, I think people got to be a little bit concerned with what's going on with the depth on the offensive line. And, you know, I don't think there was a real reason to kind of be upset with anybody individually, you know, or criticize anybody individually on the offensive line last week. I thought everybody played pretty strong. But I know that it's obviously it's a very thin line. You've got Mazuka, whose, you know, status is still kind of an unknown. You know, Corcoran shouldn't sound too optimistic there with him, you know, with him coming back. So you kind of wonder what's kind of going on with the offensive line. I think that's really the biggest one. And then I think special teams kind of sneaks in there as a number 2. I mean, you've got so many question marks going on there. You got staffing issues, you have punt coverage issues, you have, you know, the inability to kind of hit field goals. I mean, there's a lot of things in that space right there that could end up costing Nebraska down the stretch. And you definitely want to start getting some of that stuff kind of shored up. So I thought the big takeaway, though, from this last weekend against Purdue was Nebraska has not been a second-half team at all this season. They have not done anything. And they go into halftime with Purdue, you know, on the road, 0-0. And you're going, well, if history holds true here, you're not going to see a whole lot in the second half either. And they came out, you know, and they functioned. And I feel like one of those things I think that they've learned and started to believe in is themselves and their ability to kind of go in there and close a couple of games out. So I thought that they did very well in the second half. I thought that the officials were very involved in that game, and they did the best that they could to kind of get around some of that. And ultimately, I think they learned a little bit about themselves, and I think that it's going to come in handy down the road.
Okay. B-Munts, while we're going to stick onto that topic of the line, we know with like just some of the recruiting that has been going on, we know they've been attacking, you know, it doesn't matter. They've been attacking 5 stars, 4s. They're going after it. Do you believe that they're at a space now as far as attractiveness to be able to land some of these top tier recruits over the next 2 years? Because I think they need it. I think they need it bad. I also threw this out, and I want your point on to answer that. But I want your point on. I told Austin B-Months. I said, man, if I was them, I would be talking to the soccer coach, trying to get some. I'm trying to find somebody because what they got going on right now in the kick game ain't it.
Yeah. Well, let's start back at the top. So offensive line is tricky. They've obviously have taken their best swing on a couple of guys the last couple of years. Brandon Baker last year, David Sanders Jr. this year. There were a lot of guys that were also, you know, within like the radius and border states this year that they just absolutely swung on and missed. And I don't know if I can really draw a strong conclusion, you know, like on like the Babaloa, because he's going to probably head out and go to some high academic school. You have a bunch of guys that were also, you know, hanging out and staying, you know, in state, whatever state they were kind of in. So I think that Nebraska is still finding it very challenging to appeal to those top flight offensive tackles, unfortunately. I think that next year is going to be a very interesting one to watch. I think that they're in really pretty good shape, like with their top IOL, like their interior offensive lineman, like the Hudson Parliament kid from South Dakota. But offensive tackles still, like if you look at their board, it's a bit of a mystery. You really don't know like what to kind of expect and what to kind of think. Like when, you know, you see some of these guys that they're trying to recruit and you're like, they haven't even made it back to Lincoln yet this year. Now, They are going to host a pretty decent offensive tackle this weekend from Kansas. His name is Caden Snyder. He's from Salina, Kansas. But they've got some challenges. And Strick, I don't think it's the ability to land Dylan Raiola so far has not led to an easier time trying to land somebody to really go out there, the higher quality guys to block for him.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's still a challenge that they're trying to find out how, I mean, whether that's like going rate NIL wise, whether that is the appeal isn't there because you haven't won enough games. I'm not convinced of which way you're going yet with your program. I'm not sure. I think it's kind of a combination of all those things. I think also, for the guys like that they've kind of been, recruiting like Baker and Sanders. I think they had stronger relationships at a couple of those other schools too. In Nebraska, they got introduced to Sanders very quickly after Raiola got to Lincoln. Brandon Baker, everything moved very quickly with Brandon Baker, once the staff got to Lincoln, in November. So things obviously didn't really quite have that type of runway into them as what it did with some other schools. So I think that's one of the challenges. And as for like the kicking thing, boy, I tell you what, it has got to be frustrating. I mean, you've got a situation there on Saturday where it seemed like, you probably had the right angle. You probably were well within the range, and it just seems to float left. You brought back Bretton Maher to kind of help these guys out, develop some confidence, develop some better habits, maybe point out some things that they're not doing. And it just doesn't seem to have been yielding any results. And it's only been a week into that experiment, but I mean, so far it hasn't, given you that kind of confidence yet in that game. So they've got to be thinking bigger picture here. They really do. Whether that leads them to the student body to ask anybody else if they've ever done it before, certainly an option. You won't. I mean, what's scary about this? I mean, Bob Stoops has done that before. When Oklahoma hit rock bottom on their kicking game too, they went to the student body. And they went and asked everybody else to come out and try out for it as well. But I mean, you don't have that option in future years. When you go to a hard cap 105, there are no walk-ons.
Yeah.
So your roster is your roster. So if you're carrying two, let's say you're carrying two steppers and two kickers, and neither one of them is doing the job, what then?
Right.
I mean, this literally is becoming, it's kind of a precursor to a much larger issue. Your roster management is an issue when you still have the ability to go ahead and go get help, outside of the 85. Now you have to go ahead and face the opportunity, what you're looking at here down the line with the 105. And if you can't get the roster manager right, and whether that's a coaching or a development thing or confidence thing or whatever the case may be, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to work through that problem in the years to come.
Short answer on this one. So basically you can envision for the time being it being more so of transfer portal plugs for the tackle position, basically. Probably.
I think they've got to go out there and I mean, look, you've got a gap in your roster. You've got a gap in that room, right? And I think you absolutely have got to go back and get really competitive and say, I may have to establish the market here, when it comes to this thing. But if I don't, then next season, that gap and that hole, on my team, on my roster, it's going to remain. And in fact, it probably would get bigger, because I think Grant Bricks has got a lot of talent. I think he's more of a true right tackle. I just don't feel like they've got, like that really top flight left tackle. Not that I thought Brandon Baker was either. I thought Brandon Baker was going to be an all-star, all conference kind of guard. I don't think he was really an offensive tackle. I don't think he had the height or the length to kind of do it, but I really feel like, Nebraska is still looking for that guy. I think that they're going to have to go find a plug and play guy, this fall to bring him in, in January.
Let's stick on that just a little bit here, Bryan. First of all, can you make a player into a tackle, or do they kind of have to have the goods athletically that you refine once they get to campus?
Yeah, so there's kind of a there's a code to it, right? There's a framework. You have to have some length. You have to have that athleticism that you kind of mentioned before. You're talking about now a guy that's 6'5" and above. I think we've also seen the negatives of maybe being a little bit too long at that position, and realistically, those guys don't get much longer than that, like the NFL level. People just think that, the NFL level, oh, those guys are huge. Well, they're about the same size as what you're kind of seeing, at the Division I level. So they're 6'5", 6'6", 6'70", 6'7", and, you're talking about the 300, to 330 pound guys, but they're super duper athletic. They see some, the Bosas of the world and the Watts of the world. I mean, they have got to be able to move. And they have to be light on their feet. Deion Dawkins, and that's a big human being for the Buffalo Bills. But that guy has to be light on his feet, has to be able to kind of like drop anchor, and then has to be able to kind of get out on a guy, So I think that they're probably, and this is a very biased opinion, and I think a lot of people always come back at me like, yeah, but the guys that run the 4.4s and the 4.5s, they're the best athletes on the field. I tend to disagree because I just never really, it never ceases to amaze me when you see those 315, 325 pound guys that can just go out there and just move. They can move laterally. They have strength. They have balance. They have incredible control, and they're super duper long. They have like these wingspans that are enormous. I mean, they have to take up so much space. Like the radius that they have has got to be just enormous. So you have to have the measurables, right? You have to have the athleticism, and you have to have the right temperament. And I think that, and you have to be a very cerebral kind of thing. I think intelligence oftentimes gets overlooked, for guys on the offensive line. Usually those guys are some of the smartest players out there on the football field. You've got to be very intelligent when it comes to playing offensive line.
So Nebraska not landing these top offensive tackles on its board, what kind of pressure does that put on Dylan Raiola and Marcus Satterfield schematically and in the flow of the offense to maybe compensate for that lack of elite protection on the blind side especially?
Yeah, I mean, well, Dylan has really got a great ability to step up in the pocket, number one. I mean, his strength as a quarterback is that he can elongate plays because he hits his drop. He has a natural clock. And then he tends to then kind of move up in the pocket to kind of elongate and allow those receivers another second or so to kind of, set down in a zone or clear a zone, or get that another step on that guy that's in man-to-man coverage, to put it into an area so they can go out there and go get it. I think that plays very, very well for Dylan when you have those types of situations where you don't have like that great ability to shut down a guy that's on the edge. It presents other challenges, and obviously you saw some of that against Illinois when you start bringing A-gap blitzes. You step up right into a blitz. That's a problem. But I think that there's ways to kind of soften that out, particularly if you can kick some of those guys out and maybe you start to do a little bit of delayed kind of draw action, looking for that. I think it's kind of interesting too, I heard some talk about this weekend. A lot of people kind of RPO to pass. I think you can kind of RPO to run. And you can kind of go out there and design things as like kind of a tagged first pass situation with an RPO, kind of a run tag, afterward, if you get the right kind of look. And I think the difficulty there obviously is that things have got to happen very, very quickly. You got to know what kind of coverage you're in. You got to check and see what the defender's kind of doing to see if the run's going to get there. Or do you have to get rid of that football and make some passes? But I think you can run a lot of slants, a lot of glances. I think you can run some stuff that crosses a little bit and play the intermediate game a little bit. But yeah, you can soften that stuff up. You can. It's just you got to know what the right play calls are and how to do it.
It sounds to me like you're saying maybe Dylan Raiola could mentally handle something like the Dave Clawson Wake Forest slow mesh style. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
I think that's probably a pretty good comparison. I think what you really want to do is you want to work the underneath things first. And I think that's really Dylan's kind of thing. Although heck, if I had that arm, I'd want to air it out too. He has some tremendous weapons to kind of go down the football field with at all times. But I think that what you really need to do is you need to work the short to intermediate to loosen things up. And I think it loosens up the run game, and I think it loosens up things a little bit deeper. So where you're setting on the first move guys, to the outs, to the crosses, to the curls and whatever, you can at some point start to work more go double move kind of situations down the football field as you have kind of begun to kind of get those guys to draw them in a little bit more and closer to the line of scrimmage, because they're trying to protect that intermediate kind of range stuff. But yeah, I think that's probably a decent comparison.
Bryan, this has been a lot of good stuff. I don't want to miss kind of the point of why we have you on in the recruiting. It's been a couple weeks since Nebraska's had a Saturday home game. They get one against Rutgers. Have the Huskers been loading up for a bigger weekend, especially with it being an afternoon game, to maybe give some recruits time to get into Lincoln after their Friday night games?
Yeah, I think there'll be about 40 recruits in Lincoln on Saturday. There's a few headliners there, some guys that we didn't know about, earlier this week or even late last week, to where, we're starting to get some information about them. And I'm going to have a full kind of visitor preview and 3 and Out tomorrow morning. There's actually a post preview already up there on the board right now on Red Sea Scrolls. But you get like Bryce Perry Wright is coming in. He's a former teammate of Dylan Raiola, current teammate of Dayton Raiola, from Buford, Georgia, 2026 defensive lineman, 4-star guy. He's got offers from Georgia, Alabama, Auburn, Clemson. So big time dude. And then the guy that I mentioned to Strick before a little bit ago, Caden Snyder, he's coming in. He's a 4-star offensive tackle. Now he's actually been to Nebraska one time before. He was there this summer for a camp. Didn't get an offer, which I thought was a little bit interesting. So it'll be interesting to see kind of like what happens with him, this weekend, because they have not been making a lot of new offers to guys that have been visiting on the weekends. So I think Nebraska likes where they're at on their board. But now that you got an offensive tackle in town, let's see what happens there. And maybe one other guy of note that we didn't have up like on our visitor list, before today. His name is Roman Voss, and he is a athlete, probably wide receiver, maybe could play some defense too. He is from Jackson, Minnesota, big guy, 6'4", 210-ish. He's got offers from Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, K-State. So he's got some teams already looking at him. It'd be interesting to see if any new offers kind of go out this weekend, guys. Maybe one other guy of note, and I'm going to mention him tomorrow in my 3 and Out too, is Torrey Pittman. Torrey Pittman from Omaha is on fire. He's having a heck of a year. Not to mention he's pulled in some offers like we just haven't seen, guys his age kind of get before. So he's a real trendsetter in that area. So it's good to see him back in Lincoln this weekend. And also with Kylon Haney, the 2027 running back, also from Omaha Central. So who also already has a Nebraska offer. So some good news on some younger guys, in-state guys coming down there from Lincoln. Then also some bigger dudes from across the country are going to be there this weekend as well.
Let's finish with this then.
Well, quick question, since we're still in the recruiting. What about Caprice Keith?
I love him. I absolutely love Caprice Keith. Oh, are you kidding me? I saw him as a sophomore, Strick. He might have been a freshman. I'm trying to think now what age I saw him, and I couldn't get over how put together the kid was already. He's got a good body. He's got a great frame. Yeah. Could play wide receiver, could play safety. He's a two-way athlete in my mind. Nothing so far to where, you've seen him come to Lincoln yet this year. Obviously, I think he's already holding an Iowa State offer. Got some ties back to Iowa State, right? So I think he's got some relation to Breece Hall, if I remember correctly. Yeah. But yeah, so I think that's an interesting dude. One of the top guys in the state, obviously, and just have not seen him in Lincoln so far this season.
Last thing for me then, Bryan, when you look at Nebraska and some of the 26 and beyond in-state guys, how is this Nebraska staff in terms of their aggressiveness on being the first offer with these guys? Are they waiting? Are they doing their due diligence? Or are they jumping all in on a lot of these guys, maybe contrary to what we've seen in the relatively recent past?
I think that this staff has done a good mixture of both. And when I say that, I mean, it's not, they have obviously not felt like, they need to go out there and just offer for the sake of offering. They're still doing their due diligence, but they're also not waiting around. They're not waiting around for another team to come in there like an Iowa. Iowa State loves coming in and offering the kids from Nebraska very, very early. And it makes it tough because obviously it's always in the back of that kid's mind that Nebraska wasn't the first team to offer, wasn't the first school to offer. So I think Nebraska has done a good job in kind of cutting through some of the red tape and getting to that offer on some of the younger guys. And like I mentioned Haney before, that's a guy right there that he picked up an offer very early in his high school career from the Huskers. So I think that those are types of situations that we'll continue to kind of see. They know, Nebraska knows they got to keep all the dudes home that they need, to be successful. So I think you'll still see those offers go out very, very quickly, but they have a great balance of vetting and evaluating as well as getting the offer out quickly.
That's Bryan Munson of Husker Online with us here. Stay tuned for his 3 and Out that he puts up every week at huskeronline.com. Bryan, as always, we appreciate your time. Sorry about the Bills on Sunday, but look forward to talking to you next week.
I thought I was going to make it through that segment without hearing about that. All right, guys. I'll talk to you next week. We'll see you.